I never imagined my father would destroy my 8-year-old daughter's birthday gift right in front of her, but that moment changed everything between us forever. The party was supposed to be perfect in my modest 2-bedroom apartment with Emma's favorite strawberry cake and carefully chosen presents arranged on our small dining table. When my nephew Tyler ripped open her beautifully wrapped MacBook and shouted that it belonged to him, while the guests laughed nervously, I felt my stomach drop. My father Frank immediately jumped to Tyler's defense, calling Emma spoiled and ungrateful. As I reached to retrieve the laptop, Frank grabbed it from my hands and smashed it violently against the living room wall, screaming about teaching lessons on selfishness, while Emma burst into tears and her birthday party dissolved into complete chaos. That was the exact moment I realized this wasn't just about a destroyed gift. This was about something much deeper, something that would define how I protected my daughter for the rest of our lives. The silver laptop lay in pieces on my hardwood floor, its screen shattered into sharp fragments that reflected the overhead light like broken dreams. Emma stood frozen beside her birthday cake, her small hands covering her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. The other children at the party backed away from the wreckage, their parents exchanging uncomfortable glances and whispering among themselves about whether they should leave. Tyler, still clutching the torn wrapping paper, looked confused by the sudden violence. His mother, Janet, stood in the corner, her face pale, as she realized her son had been used as a weapon in some family conflict she didn't understand. The birthday candles continued flickering on Emma's untouched cake, creating dancing shadows across the walls of what should have been a celebration. Frank stood over the destroyed laptop with his chest heaving, his gray hair disheveled from the sudden outburst. His weathered hands were clenched into fists, and his blue eyes held a satisfaction that made my blood run cold. This 60-year-old man who had raised me was looking at his granddaughter's devastation with something that resembled pleasure. Maybe now she'll learn that the world doesn't revolve around her. Frank said, his voice still elevated from the shouting. Kids these days think they deserve everything handed to them on a silver platter. I knelt beside Emma, pulling her small body against my chest as she sobbed into my shirt. The scent of her strawberry shampoo mixed with the smell of birthday cake and the sharp electronic odor from the destroyed laptop. Around us, the party guests began gathering their belongings and making awkward excuses about early bedtimes and weekend plans. "Emma, sweetheart, we're going to fix this," I whispered into her hair, though I had no idea how to replace a $2,000 laptop on my marketing coordinator salary. "Daddy's going to make this right." But even as I spoke those words, I knew this went far beyond buying a replacement computer. This was about respect boundaries and protecting my daughter from the toxic dysfunction that had poisoned my family for generations. As I held Emma's trembling body and watched Frank straighten his shirt like nothing had happened, I felt something cold and calculating settle into my chest. The birthday party was over, but my real work was just beginning. The deeper betrayal hit me like a freight train when Frank pulled me aside after the last guest had left, his expression shifting from righteous anger to something that resembled smugness. Emma had finally stopped crying and was picking up the pieces of her broken laptop with the careful concentration that only children possess when trying to fix something precious that adults have destroyed. "You brought this on yourself, Edgar," Frank said, keeping his voice low so Emma couldn't hear from across the room. "You think you're so much better than the rest of us since your fancy divorce and your office job?" The words struck me as completely disconnected from reality. My divorce from Sarah had been bitter and financially devastating, leaving me with barely enough money to afford this small apartment and Emma's weekend visits. My job as a marketing coordinator at a mid-sized insurance company was steady but hardly glamorous, involving long hours creating promotional materials and managing client communications for barely enough salary to cover child support and basic living expenses. What does my job have to do with Emma's birthday present? I asked, genuine confusion mixing with the anger that was building in my chest. Frank's laugh was harsh and bitter. You refused to help me with the loan for my hardware store, remember? Left your old man hanging when his business is going under. So I figured it was time you learned what consequences feel like. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. 3 weeks earlier, Frank had asked me to co-sign a $15,000 loan to keep his struggling hardware store afloat. I had explained that with my child support payments and the debt from my divorce, taking on additional financial responsibility would put my ability to care for Emma at risk. It had been a difficult conversation, but I thought we had ended it with mutual understanding. You planned this. The words came out as barely a whisper as the full scope of his manipulation became clear. You told Tyler to grab Emma's laptop. Yeah, smart boy Tyler. He understands family loyalty better than you do. Frank's satisfaction was unmistakable now. I've been telling your sister and your cousins about how you've gotten too good for us regular folks. How you think your college education makes you special. My mind reeled as I tried to process the calculated cruelty of using my nephew and daughter as pawns in some twisted lesson about family obligation. Emma was still on her hands and knees, carefully placing laptop fragments into a shoebox, like she was conducting a funeral for her destroyed birthday dreams. You convinced a 10-year-old boy to hurt his cousin to get back at me for making a responsible financial decision. I convinced a 10-year-old boy to teach his spoiled cousin about sharing. Frank corrected his tone, suggesting he genuinely believed this narrative. And I taught my ungrateful son about respecting his elders. The apartment felt suddenly too small, too airless. The birthday decorations that Emma and I had hung together that morning now looked garish and mocking in the aftermath of the destruction. Streamers hung limply from the ceiling, and the remaining birthday cake sat untouched on the table like evidence of childhood innocence that had been sacrificed for adult revenge. For months, Edgar, months I've been telling people what kind of man you really are. How you abandoned your family the minute you got a little success. How you think you're too good to help your own father keep his business running. Each word felt like another piece of a puzzle clicking into place. The strange silences during recent family gatherings. The way my Aunt Susan had stopped returning my phone calls. The uncomfortable tension whenever I tried to make conversation with my cousins at family events. Frank had been systematically poisoning every relationship I had with our extended family, presenting my financial caution as arrogance and my independence as betrayal. The destroyed laptop wasn't an impulsive act of anger. It was the culmination of a months-long campaign designed to humiliate me in front of people I cared about while teaching me the price of refusing his demands. Emma looked up from her careful collection of laptop pieces, her face streaked with dried tears, but her expression determined. "Daddy, can we glue it back together?" The innocence in her question broke something inside my chest. She still believed that broken things could be fixed, that adults could undo the damage they had caused, that her grandfather's violence had been some terrible mistake, rather than a deliberate lesson in family power dynamics. "We'll figure something out, sweetheart." I said, though my attention was focused entirely on Frank's self-satisfied expression. As Emma returned to her futile repair efforts, I felt something cold and calculating settle into the space where my shock and hurt had been. Frank wanted to teach me about consequences and family loyalty. He wanted to show me what happened when I prioritized my daughter's stability over his business problems. But as I watched my 8-year-old daughter trying to resurrect her destroyed birthday gift while my father stood smugly in my living room, I realized that Frank had made a critical miscalculation. He had shown me exactly who he was and exactly how far he was willing to go to maintain control over our family. Now it was my turn to teach him about consequences. The investigation started the next morning when I called my younger sister Claire, hoping to understand how deep Frank's manipulation had spread through our family network. Claire worked as a nurse at the county hospital and had always been the most level-headed person in our family. But her response to my phone call immediately told me that Frank's poison had reached her as well. "Edgar." I heard about what happened at Emma's party. She said, her voice carrying a tone of disappointment that I had never heard directed at me before. Maybe you should think about why Dad felt like he had to make such a dramatic point. Claire, he destroyed a $2,000 laptop that I saved for months to buy Emma. He traumatized her in front of all her friends. How is that making a point about anything? There was a long pause before she continued, and I could hear the conflict in her voice. He told me about the loan, Edgar. About how you wouldn't help him save the store that's been in our family for 20 years. The hardware store had never been in our family for 20 years. Frank had purchased it 7 years ago with money from his divorce settlement, and it had been struggling almost from the beginning due to competition from big box retailers and Frank's poor business management. But Claire's version of events suggested that Frank had rewritten the entire history to cast himself as a victim of family betrayal. Claire, I couldn't co-sign that loan. With my child support payments and my divorce debt taking on additional financial responsibility would mean I couldn't afford Emma's expenses. You know how tight money has been since Sarah and I split up. Another pause. Dad said you've gotten comfortable in your new life, that you've forgotten where you came from. The phrase sounded exactly like something Frank would say, delivered with the particular mix of guilt and accusation that he had perfected over decades of family manipulation. But hearing it from Claire, who had held Emma as a baby and helped me move into my apartment after the divorce, felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than Frank's calculated cruelty. Claire, do you really believe that I would abandon Emma's needs to prove some point about family loyalty? Do you think I enjoyed telling Dad no about the loan? The question hung in the air between us, and I heard something shift in Claire's breathing. No, she said finally, her voice smaller. No, you've always put Emma first. But Edgar, he seems so desperate about the store. What else has he told you about me? He said you've been looking down on the family since you got your college degree. That you think you're too good for us now that you work in an office instead of with your hands. I'd graduated from community college 8 years ago while working full-time at a factory, attending night classes and weekend sessions to earn an associate degree in business administration. The transition to office work had been motivated entirely by the need for stable income and health insurance after Emma was born. Frank had seemed proud of my achievement at the time, bragging to his friends about his son's education and career advancement. But as Claire continued talking, I realized that Frank had transformed my modest success into evidence of family betrayal, using my education and career change as proof that I had rejected our family's working-class values. Claire, has he told you anything else about other family members? What do you mean? Has he mentioned anything about Aunt Dorothy or Uncle Robert or anyone else in the family? Claire's hesitation told me everything I needed to know. He did mention that Dorothy has been having some financial troubles, and that Uncle Robert has been saying some concerning things about David's parenting. Dorothy was our 78-year-old aunt who lived alone in the house, where she and her late husband had raised 4 children. Robert was Frank's younger brother, and David was my older brother who lived across the country with his own family. The idea that Robert would criticize David's parenting to Frank instead of directly addressing any concerns with David himself seemed completely out of character. Claire, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. When was the last time you talked to Dorothy directly? I don't know. Maybe 6 months ago. Dad usually updates me on how she's doing. A cold realization began forming in my chest. And when was the last time you talked to Uncle Robert without Dad being involved? Edgar, what are you getting at? I think Dad has been controlling information between family members. I think he's been telling different people different stories to keep us from comparing notes. Claire was quiet for a long moment. That's a pretty serious accusation. Yesterday, he admitted that he planned Emma's laptop destruction as punishment for me refusing to co-sign his loan. He orchestrated my daughter's trauma to teach me a lesson about family loyalty. Does that sound like someone who would hesitate to manipulate other family relationships? I could hear Claire moving around, probably pacing the way she did when she was processing difficult information. What do you want me to do? I want you to call Dorothy directly. Ask her about her financial situation. Find out if Dad has been borrowing money from her. Edgar, if you're wrong about this, if I'm wrong, then I'll apologize to everyone and figure out how to rebuild the relationships that my paranoia damaged. But if I'm right, then we need to know how many people he's been manipulating. After Claire hung up, I spent the rest of the morning making careful notes about everything Frank had said and done. I documented the timeline of events leading up to Emma's party, including his loan request and my refusal. I wrote down his exact words about planning the laptop incident and his admission that he had been spreading negative information about me to other family members. By noon, my phone rang. It was Claire, and her voice was shaking. Edgar, though, I called Dorothy. She's been giving Dad money for months. Small amounts at first, but it's added up to over $3,000. She thought it was to help with the hardware store, but she also thought he was paying her back because he told her Uncle Robert said she shouldn't worry about repayment. Did you call Uncle Robert? I called Robert. He never said anything to Dad about Dorothy's money. And Edgar, there's more. Robert said Dad has been telling him that David thinks Robert is a terrible father. But when I called David, he said he's never discussed Robert's parenting with anyone. The scope of Frank's manipulation was beginning to reveal itself. He had been systematically creating conflicts and misunderstandings between family members, positioning himself as the central source of information, while ensuring that no one compared notes directly. Claire, I think we need to talk to our cousin Marcus. Marcus was a police officer in the next county over, and he had always been the family member most skilled at seeing through emotional manipulation. If Frank was borrowing money from elderly relatives under false pretenses and creating family conflicts through deliberate misinformation, Marcus would know how to investigate properly and what legal implications might exist. But as I dialed Marcus's number, I realized that my investigation was revealing something much darker than simple family drama. Frank wasn't just manipulating relationships for emotional control. He was systematically exploiting elderly relatives financially while destroying family bonds to prevent anyone from discovering his activities. Emma's destroyed laptop was just the most visible symptom of a much deeper disease that had been spreading through our family for months. Marcus agreed to meet me for coffee that evening, and his expression grew increasingly grim as I explained what Claire and I had discovered about Frank's manipulation network. As a police officer with 12 years of experience, Marcus had developed a professional ability to separate emotion from facts, but I could see anger building behind his careful composure. Edgar, what you're describing sounds like a pattern we see in elder abuse cases. He said, his voice low so other customers couldn't overhear our conversation. Financial exploitation combined with isolation tactics to prevent victims from seeking help or comparing experiences. I never thought of it as elder abuse. It's just family drama. Family drama doesn't involve systematically borrowing money from elderly relatives under false pretenses. Family drama doesn't involve deliberately creating conflicts to prevent family members from communicating with each other. Marcus pulled out a small notebook and began asking specific questions about dates, amounts, and conversations. His methodical approach transformed what had felt like personal betrayal into evidence of potentially criminal behavior. The amount Dorothy gave him probably doesn't meet the threshold for felony charges, but if there are other victims, or if he's used deception to obtain the money, it could still result in misdemeanor fraud charges, Marcus explained. But Edgar, there's something else you need to consider. This level of manipulation and control doesn't usually limit itself to money. What do you mean? I mean that people who exploit elderly relatives financially often engage in other forms of abuse as well. Have you considered that Frank might be manipulating Dorothy in ways beyond just taking her money? The possibility sent ice through my veins. Dorothy lived alone in a house that was becoming increasingly difficult for her to maintain. She had mild arthritis that made some daily tasks challenging, and she had been talking about potentially moving to a retirement community. If Frank was her primary source of family contact, he could easily influence her decisions about living arrangements, medical care, and financial planning. Marcus, I need to visit Dorothy. We both need to visit Dorothy, and we need to do it soon. But as Marcus put away his notebook, his expression remained troubled. Edgar, there's something else I need to tell you. In the past 6 months, I've received 3 separate complaints about a contractor in Dad's area who's been scamming elderly residents with unnecessary home repairs. Frank runs a hardware store, not a contracting business. The complaints described a man matching Frank's description who approaches elderly homeowners claiming to notice problems with their roofs or foundations. He offers to fix the problems for cash payments, does substandard work or no work at all, and disappears when the homeowners try to follow up. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Frank wasn't just manipulating family members and borrowing money from elderly relatives. He was apparently running systematic scams against vulnerable seniors throughout the community. Why haven't you arrested him? The complaints were filed in different jurisdictions, and none of the victims could provide the perpetrator's full name or contact information. He was smart enough to use only his first name and pay attention to which neighborhoods had better organized community watch programs. Marcus leaned forward, his expression intense. But if this is the same person, and if we can connect him to these activities through evidence you help gather, we could build a comprehensive case that would result in serious criminal charges. What kind of charges? Multiple counts of fraud against elderly victims, possibly theft by deception, potentially even racketeering, if we can show a pattern of organized criminal activity. The magnitude of what Marcus was describing overwhelmed me. Frank wasn't just a difficult family member who had destroyed my daughter's birthday gift in a moment of anger. He was apparently a predator who specifically targeted vulnerable elderly people for financial exploitation. Edgar, I need you to understand something. If we pursue this investigation, it's going to destroy what's left of your relationship with Frank permanently. There won't be any going back to family dinners and pretending everything is fine. He destroyed my 8-year-old daughter's birthday gift to punish me for refusing to enable his business failures. He's been systematically poisoning my relationships with other family members for months. He's apparently stealing money from Aunt Dorothy and potentially scamming other elderly people in the community. I paused, thinking about Emma carefully collecting the pieces of her broken laptop. I think that relationship was destroyed long before I started investigating. Marcus nodded. Then we need to move carefully and gather as much evidence as possible before Frank realizes what we're doing. Can you reach out to other family members without arousing his suspicion? I think so. Claire is already making calls to verify information. And Frank is so confident in his manipulation that he probably assumes no one would dare to fact-check his stories. Good. I'll start making discreet inquiries with other police departments about the contractor scams. And Edgar, we need to document everything going forward, every conversation, every discovery, every piece of evidence. As I drove home from meeting Marcus, I felt the weight of what we had uncovered settling over me like a heavy blanket. Frank's destruction of Emma's laptop hadn't been an isolated incident or even simple family dysfunction. It was part of a broader pattern of manipulation, exploitation, and abuse that affected multiple vulnerable people. But I also felt something else building in my chest alongside the shock and anger. For months, Frank had been controlling the narrative about our family relationships, presenting himself as the victim of my ingratitude, while systematically exploiting elderly relatives and community members. He had used Emma's birthday party as a stage for humiliating me while teaching my daughter that adults could destroy precious things without consequence. Now it was time to start building a different narrative, one based on truth, evidence, and accountability. Frank wanted to teach me about consequences and family loyalty. But he was about to learn that the most dangerous consequence of predatory behavior is eventually targeting someone who refuses to be a victim. The call from Claire came at 6 a.m, 3 days after my meeting with Marcus. Her voice was tight with panic as she explained that our 92-year-old grandfather, William, had been admitted to the hospital overnight with chest pains and confusion. Edgar, there's something else. When the paramedics brought Grandpa William to the emergency room, Frank was already there. He had a manila folder full of papers that he said were legal documents William had asked him to handle. What kind of legal documents? Changes to his will power of attorney forms and something about transferring ownership of his house. Edgar, the papers looked fresh, like they had just been printed. William owned the small ranch house where he had lived for 45 years, along with a savings account that he had carefully built through decades of working as a telephone company technician. He had always been sharp and independent, insisting on managing his own finances and maintaining his own household despite his advanced age. Is William okay? Is he coherent? He's stable, but he's been confused since yesterday. The doctors think he might have had a small stroke or experienced a medication interaction. Edgar, when I tried to ask him about the legal documents, Frank pulled me aside and said William had been worried about how to divide his assets fairly among family members who actually deserved them. The timing felt too convenient to be coincidental. William's sudden medical crisis occurring simultaneously, with Frank's appearance at the hospital carrying fresh legal documents, suggested a level of planning that made my stomach turn. Claire, where is Frank now? He went home to get some rest, but he said he'd be back this afternoon to help William sign the papers. He said William was worried about running out of time to get his affairs in order. Don't let him sign anything. Tell the nursing staff that no legal documents should be signed while William is medically compromised. Edgar, I can't just accuse Dad of trying to manipulate Grandpa William. What if he really is just trying to help? Claire, 3 days ago, we confirmed that he's been stealing money from Aunt Dorothy while systematically destroying family relationships through lies and manipulation. Yesterday, Marcus told me he's probably been running contractor scams against elderly people throughout the community. Now, William has a sudden medical emergency, and Frank appears with freshly printed legal documents transferring William's assets. How many coincidences are you willing to accept? There was a long pause before Claire responded. What do you want me to do? I want you to stay with William and make sure he doesn't sign anything without having time to review it with someone who isn't Frank. I'm calling Marcus and then driving to the hospital. But as I ended the call and began getting dressed, my mind was racing with implications that went beyond just protecting William from immediate manipulation. If Frank was willing to exploit his own father's medical vulnerability to steal inheritance from the rest of the family, it meant that no elderly relative was safe from his schemes. More importantly, it meant that Frank's manipulation had escalated from emotional and financial abuse to potentially life-threatening exploitation of medically compromised elderly victims. I called Marcus while driving to the hospital, explaining the situation and asking what legal protections might be available to prevent Frank from coercing William into signing documents while he was medically impaired. Legally, contracts signed by someone who lacks mental capacity due to medical conditions can be voided, but it's much easier to prevent the signing than to undo it after the fact, Marcus explained. I'll meet you at the hospital, and we can request that the medical staff document William's cognitive state. Marcus, there's something else. If Frank is willing to manipulate his own father while he's medically vulnerable, how many other elderly people has he targeted during health crises? That's exactly what I was thinking. Edgar and I made some calls yesterday about those contractor scam complaints. The victims described a man who seemed to know personal details about their families and health situations. Details that would be difficult to obtain unless he had systematic access to information about elderly residents. What kind of access? The kind that comes from volunteering at senior centers, working for home care agencies, or having family members who work in healthcare and share information inappropriately. The possibility that Frank had been using healthcare connections or volunteer positions to identify vulnerable elderly targets transformed my understanding of the scope of his criminal activities. This wasn't just family dysfunction or even isolated fraud cases. This was potentially organized predatory behavior that could affect dozens of elderly victims. When I arrived at the hospital, William was awake, but clearly disoriented. He recognized me and Claire, but he seemed confused about why he was in the hospital and kept asking about papers that someone wanted him to sign. Edgar, is that you? William's voice was weak but alert. Frank said you've been busy with work and didn't have time to visit family anymore. I'm here now, Grandpa. How are you feeling? Confused mostly. Frank brought some papers about the house and my savings account. Said other family members were concerned about my ability to manage things properly. Claire and I exchanged glances. Frank had apparently been preparing William for the manipulation by suggesting that other family members doubted his competence, creating justification for transferring assets to Frank's control. Grandpa, who told Frank that other family members were concerned. William's forehead wrinkled with confusion. I don't remember. Maybe your Aunt Dorothy or your Uncle Robert Frank said several people had talked to him about my situation. But I knew from our recent conversations that neither Dorothy nor Robert had expressed any concerns about William's mental capacity or financial management. Frank had fabricated the family concerns to create urgency around the legal document signing while William was medically vulnerable. Marcus arrived with a social worker from the hospital's Elder Protection Department, and together they documented William's medical condition and cognitive state. The social worker explained that while William was alert and oriented to person and placed his confusion about recent events and his medication-induced disorientation meant that any legal documents signed during his hospitalization could be challenged as invalid. Mr. Johnson, we're going to recommend that any important legal decisions be postponed until after you've been discharged and have had time to recover from this medical episode, the social worker explained. But as we were preparing to leave, Frank arrived carrying a briefcase and wearing an expression of determined concern that I now recognized as his manipulation face. Edgar, I'm surprised to see you here. He said, his tone suggesting that my presence was inappropriate rather than natural for a grandson visiting his hospitalized grandfather. I thought you were too busy with your own life to worry about family responsibilities. I'm here to make sure Grandpa William gets the support he needs without being pressured into making important decisions while he's medically compromised. Frank's expression shifted slightly, and I saw him calculating how to respond to my direct challenge. William asked me to help him get his affairs in order. He's worried about being a burden on the family. Grandpa, did you ask Frank to prepare legal documents for you to sign? William looked confused again. I don't remember asking for papers. Frank said other people thought I needed help, so I thought maybe it was a good idea. The social worker stepped forward. Mr. Johnson, we're going to recommend that you wait until after you're feeling better before making any major decisions about your finances or property. Frank's jaw tightened, but he nodded politely. Of course, family comes first. But as he turned to leave, his eyes met mine, with an expression of cold fury that told me he knew exactly what I was doing. The pretense of concerned family member was cracking, revealing something much more calculating and dangerous underneath. Frank had been building toward this moment for months, systematically isolating family members and positioning himself as the responsible caretaker while eliminating anyone who might interfere with his control over elderly relatives' resources. Now he knew that I wasn't going to be manipulated or intimidated into stepping aside. The careful game of family dysfunction was about to become something much more direct and much more dangerous. The phone call that changed everything came from my ex-wife Sarah exactly 1 week after William's hospital incident. Her voice was tight with controlled anger as she explained why she was calling. Edgar, I just received the most bizarre phone call from a reporter at Channel 7 News. They wanted to ask me about family conflicts and financial disputes. They said they were doing a story about ungrateful children who abandon their aging parents. My blood turned to ice. What exactly did they tell you? They said they had been contacted by your father about a story of family betrayal, about how his successful son had refused to help save the family business and was now interfering with efforts to help elderly relatives manage their finances properly. Frank had escalated beyond manipulation and theft. He was now using media attention to publicly destroy my reputation, while simultaneously creating justification for his control over elderly family members' assets. Sarah, there's something you need to know about what's really been happening with my father. I spent 20 minutes explaining everything I had discovered about Frank's manipulation network, his exploitation of Dorothy the contractor scams that Marcus was investigating, and the suspicious timing of William's medical crisis. Sarah listened without interrupting, her silence growing more ominous as the scope of Frank's activities became clear. Edgar, during our divorce proceedings, your father approached me several times. He told me you were hiding money from the settlement. He gave me specific details about bank accounts and investments that I couldn't verify. What kind of details? He said you had opened secret accounts and were planning to move money offshore to avoid child support payments. He provided account numbers and bank names. When my attorney investigated, the accounts didn't exist, but the information was so specific that we spent months and thousands of dollars in legal fees trying to track down assets that were never real. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Frank had actively sabotaged my divorce proceedings by feeding false information to Sarah's legal team, prolonging the conflict and increasing the financial devastation for both of us. Sarah, those false leads cost me money too. My attorney had to respond to discovery requests for non-existent accounts and defend against accusations of hidden assets. Frank's lies turned our divorce into a war that destroyed both our finances. Edgar, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Did you ever tell your father that I was being unreasonable about custody arrangements? No, never. Why? Because he told me you had said I was trying to alienate Emma from your family. He said you were frustrated with my demands, but didn't know how to stand up to me without making the custody situation worse. Frank had been playing both sides of our divorce, feeding each of us false information about what the other person was saying and thinking. His manipulation had transformed a difficult but manageable separation into a bitter conflict that damaged both our finances and our ability to co-parent effectively. Sarah, how many times did Frank contact you during the divorce? Maybe 8 or 10 times. He said he was trying to help mediate because he could see how much the conflict was hurting Emma. Did he ever suggest specific legal strategies or recommend particular approaches to custody negotiations? Yes. He said I should push for more restrictive visitation because you were becoming emotionally unstable due to the financial pressure. He said you had made comments about possibly moving out of state to avoid child support payments. Every piece of Frank's manipulation had been designed to escalate conflict, while positioning himself as the concerned family member trying to help resolve the crisis he had created. He had systematically fed false information to both sides while presenting himself as a neutral mediator. Sarah, the reporter who called you, is part of Frank's plan to publicly humiliate me while justifying his control over elderly family members. He's going to present himself as the victim of an ungrateful son who refuses to help aging relatives. What are you going to do? I'm going to give that reporter a much better story than the one Frank is trying to sell. After ending the call with Sarah, I immediately contacted Marcus to explain Frank's media strategy and coordinate our response. Marcus had been building a comprehensive case file that included not just the contractor scam complaints, but also documentation of Frank's financial exploitation of Dorothy and evidence of his manipulation tactics within the family. Edgar, this is actually perfect. If Frank wants public attention, we can use that attention to expose his criminal activities to a much wider audience than just law enforcement. What do you mean? I mean that we've been building a case that would normally take months to investigate and prosecute through normal channels. But if Frank is inviting media scrutiny, we can present all our evidence publicly and let the court of public opinion pressure the district attorney's office to prioritize prosecution. Marcus explained that elder abuse cases often received minimal attention from overwhelmed prosecutors unless there was public pressure or media interest. Frank's attempt to use the media against me could backfire spectacularly if we were prepared with comprehensive evidence of his criminal activities. Marcus, what about the other victims? the elderly people he's been scamming with contractor fraud. I've been working with investigators in 3 different counties to identify victims and gather evidence. If we can coordinate their testimony with your family's evidence and present everything simultaneously to the media, it creates a much more powerful case than isolated incidents. But as Marcus outlined the strategy, I realized we were approaching a point of no return. Once we publicly exposed Frank's activities, there would be no possibility of private resolution or family reconciliation. Frank would face criminal charges, public humiliation, and the complete destruction of his relationships with every family member he had manipulated. Edgar, are you prepared for what this is going to do to your family? Some people are going to blame you for destroying Frank's life even after they learn about his criminal activities. He destroyed my daughter's birthday gift to punish me for making a responsible financial decision. He's been stealing from elderly relatives while systematically poisoning family relationships. He sabotaged my divorce and is now trying to publicly humiliate me to cover up his crimes. I thought about Emma asking if we could glue her broken laptop back together. Some things can't be fixed by pretending they never broke. The next morning, I called the Channel 7 reporter and explained that I had information about the story she was investigating that might change her perspective on the family conflict Frank had described. Ms. Rodriguez, before you broadcast anything about family disputes, I think you should know that my father is currently under investigation for elder abuse and contractor fraud targeting senior citizens throughout this county. The silence on the other end of the line told me that Frank had not mentioned those details when he pitched his story about ungrateful children abandoning their aging parents. Frank wanted to use the media to destroy my reputation and justify his exploitation of elderly family members. Instead, he was about to become the center of a public exposure that would reveal the true scope of his predatory activities to the entire community. The family reunion Frank had organized for the following Sunday was supposed to be his masterstroke of manipulation, but it became the stage for his complete downfall instead. He had invited every family member he could contact, along with Channel 7 reporter Carmen Rodriguez and her camera crew, to witness what he described as an intervention about Edgar's abandonment of family responsibilities. Frank had chosen Riverside Park for the gathering, apparently believing that the public setting would prevent any dramatic confrontations while providing an ideal backdrop for his media presentation. He had even prepared remarks about the importance of family loyalty and the painful necessity of public accountability when private conversations failed. But as family members began arriving that Sunday afternoon, it became clear that Frank's carefully orchestrated narrative was already unraveling. Claire and Marcus had spent the week making phone calls and comparing stories, and the web of lies that Frank had used to control family relationships was dissolving under scrutiny. Uncle Robert arrived with a stack of printed emails showing that Frank had been forging communications between family members, creating fake conflicts and false grievances that had kept relatives from talking directly to each other for months. Aunt Dorothy brought bank statements documenting every payment she had made to Frank, along with records showing that none of the promised repayments had ever occurred. Most damaging of all 3 elderly neighbors from Frank's community attended the reunion accompanied by Marcus and Detective Lisa Chen from the County Fraud Investigation Unit. These were the contractor scam victims, and they had brought photographs of the substandard repair work Frank had performed along with copies of the cash receipts he had provided for services never completed. Carmen Rodriguez and her camera crew were present, as Frank had requested, but the story they were prepared to broadcast had changed completely from the family conflict narrative Frank had pitched. Rodriguez had spent the week investigating the criminal complaints against Frank, and she now had questions about elder abuse and community fraud rather than ungrateful children. Frank arrived at the park carrying a folder of what he claimed were testimonials from family members supporting his position, but his confidence began cracking the moment he saw the size of the crowd and realized that Marcus was accompanied by law enforcement officers. "Edgar, I'm glad you decided to show up," Frank said, his voice carrying forced cheerfulness that didn't match his increasingly nervous expression. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about family responsibilities in front of people who can judge the situation fairly. I agree completely, I replied, gesturing toward Detective Chen and the elderly victims Frank had been systematically exploiting. Let's have an honest conversation about all of your family and community responsibilities. The next 30 minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed legal proceeding, with each piece of evidence building toward an overwhelming case against Frank's criminal activities. Claire presented the documentation of his lies about family members, showing how he had created false conflicts to prevent relatives from comparing notes about his behavior. Dorothy explained how Frank had convinced her that other family members thought she needed financial help, borrowing increasing amounts of money under false pretenses while promising repayment that never materialized. Uncle Robert described how Frank had forged emails to create fake grievances between family members, systematically isolating people who might otherwise have discovered his manipulation tactics. The elderly contractor scam victims told their stories of Frank appearing at their homes, claiming to notice urgent repair problems, accepting cash payments for work that was either never completed or performed so poorly that it created additional damage requiring expensive professional remediation. Carmen Rodriguez recorded everything, occasionally asking clarifying questions that helped connect the various criminal activities into a coherent pattern of predatory behavior targeting vulnerable, elderly victims. But the most powerful moment came when Tyler's mother, Janet, stepped forward to explain how Frank had threatened her family to ensure Tyler's cooperation in destroying Emma's laptop. Frank told me that Edgar was teaching Emma to be selfish and disrespectful, and that the only way to correct her behavior was to show her consequences for greed. Janet said, her voice shaking with anger. He said that if Tyler didn't grab the laptop, Frank would tell other family members that my husband and I were bad parents who couldn't control our son. The revelation that Frank had used threats against a 10-year-old child's parents to orchestrate Emma's trauma brought shocked silence from the assembled family members. Even relatives who had initially supported Frank's position began understanding the calculated cruelty behind his actions. Detective Chen stepped forward with arrest warrants charging Frank with multiple counts of fraud against elderly victims, theft by deception, and elder abuse. As she read his rights, Frank's carefully maintained facade of concerned family patriarch finally collapsed completely. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice rising to the same pitch it had reached when he destroyed Emma's laptop. "These people are lying because Edgar has turned them against me. He's been poisoning the family against me for months because I tried to teach his spoiled daughter about sharing." But nobody was listening to Frank's protestations anymore. The evidence was overwhelming, the victims were credible, and the pattern of manipulation and abuse was undeniable. Carmen Rodriguez had enough material for a week-long series about elder abuse and family manipulation, with Frank as the central predator whose activities had affected dozens of victims throughout the community. As Frank was led away in handcuffs, Emma stepped out from behind Sarah's protective embrace and walked over to where Tyler was standing with his parents. The two children looked at each other for a moment before Emma spoke. "Tyler, I know Grandpa Frank scared your mom and dad. I'm not mad at you for taking my laptop. I'm mad at him for making you hurt me." Tyler's eyes filled with tears as he apologized, and the two children hugged while their parents watched with expressions of relief and pride. In that moment, Frank's manipulation lost its final hold over our family, as the next generation chose forgiveness and healing over the anger and division he had spent months cultivating. The arrest became front-page news, with follow-up stories about community awareness of elder abuse and the importance of family members communicating directly, rather than relying on intermediaries who might have hidden agendas. Frank's hardware store closed permanently, and the criminal prosecution resulted in convictions on multiple fraud charges, along with restitution orders for all identified victims. But more importantly, the public exposure of Frank's activities eliminated any possibility of future manipulation or abuse. Every elderly person in our community now knew his name and his tactics, and every family member understood how he had systematically exploited trust and authority to harm vulnerable people. Frank's attempt to publicly humiliate me while justifying his control over elderly relatives had instead exposed him as a predator whose criminal activities affected an entire community. The media attention he had sought to destroy my reputation became the mechanism for protecting future victims from his manipulation and abuse. 6 months after Frank's arrest and conviction, Emma and I sat in our living room assembling her new MacBook while she told me about her school presentation on standing up to bullies. The replacement laptop was identical to the one Frank had destroyed, but Emma had insisted on paying for half of it with birthday money from relatives who wanted to make up for the trauma she had experienced at her party. Daddy, my teacher, said that sometimes adults can be bullies too, and that kids need to learn how to ask for help when grown-ups do scary things. Emma said, carefully peeling the protective film from her laptop screen. Is that what you did when Grandpa Frank was mean to us? That's exactly what I did, sweetheart. I asked Uncle Marcus and Aunt Claire and other people to help protect you and protect other people who were being hurt. Emma nodded thoughtfully. And now Grandpa Frank can't hurt other kids or grandmas anymore because everyone knows what he was doing. The simplicity of her understanding amazed me. At 8 years old, Emma had grasped the essential truth that Frank's manipulation and abuse had been stopped not by private family negotiations or attempts to manage his behavior, but by exposing his actions to public accountability and legal consequences. Sarah had become an unexpected ally in rebuilding our family relationships, acknowledging how Frank's manipulation during our divorce had escalated conflicts and created unnecessary pain for everyone involved. We were now co-parenting more effectively than we'd managed even during our marriage, united by our shared experience of Frank's systematic deception and our commitment to protecting Emma from future manipulation. Claire had taken over coordinating care for William, who was recovering well from his medical episode, and had expressed relief that someone trustworthy was helping manage his needs without pressuring him to make unnecessary changes to his living situation or financial arrangements. Dorothy had moved into a retirement community where she felt safer and more socially connected, using money recovered through Frank's restitution payments to pay for improved care. Uncle Robert and Aunt Susan had begun hosting monthly family dinners, where relatives could maintain direct contact without relying on intermediaries to share information or coordinate activities. The gatherings were smaller than previous family events, but they were built on genuine relationships rather than obligation and manipulation. Marcus had been promoted to detective after his work on Frank's case led to the identification and prosecution of a broader network of individuals running contractor scams against elderly residents. The investigation had resulted in policy changes at the county level designed to better protect senior citizens from predatory repair schemes and financial exploitation. Tyler visited us regularly, and he and Emma had developed a close friendship built on mutual understanding of how adults' bad choices had affected their relationship. Tyler's parents had become advocates for teaching children about manipulation tactics and the importance of telling trusted adults when they feel pressured to participate in activities that make them uncomfortable. The most profound change, though, was in my understanding of family loyalty and responsibility. Frank had taught me that protecting vulnerable family members sometimes requires destroying the illusion of family unity that allows abuse to continue unchallenged. Real love and loyalty means prioritizing safety and truth over comfort and false peace. Emma's laptop incident had been the catalyst for exposing criminal activities that affected dozens of elderly victims throughout our community. By refusing to accept Frank's manipulation and investigating his behavior systematically, we had prevented future abuse while creating accountability for past crimes. Emma, do you remember what we learned about fixing broken things? Some things can't be glued back together the same way they were before, but we can make something new that works better, she said, running her hands over her new laptop with satisfaction. Carmen Rodriguez had won a regional journalism award for her series about elder abuse and family manipulation, and the story had led to legislative changes requiring better oversight of home repair contractors and stronger protections for elderly residents facing financial exploitation. Frank's case had become a model for how community awareness and family courage could work together to protect vulnerable people from predatory abuse. Frank was serving 18 months in county jail, followed by probation and community service, during which time he was prohibited from contact with elderly residents outside of supervised family visits. He had written several letters apologizing for his behavior and asking for forgiveness, but none of us felt obligated to provide reconciliation that he had not earned through genuine behavior change. "Daddy, when I grow up, I want to help protect kids and grandmas like you did." What kind of job do you think does that? Maybe a police officer like Uncle Marcus, or a lawyer who helps people, or someone who writes for newspapers like the lady who told everyone about Grandpa Frank's bad choices. Emma's career aspirations reflected her understanding that protecting vulnerable people requires courage, persistence, and the willingness to confront difficult truths, even when doing so creates conflict with people we love. She had learned that justice sometimes demands temporary pain to prevent ongoing harm. As we finished setting up Emma's laptop and she began exploring its features, I reflected on the unexpected gift that Frank's cruelty had provided. By destroying Emma's birthday present to teach me about consequences and family loyalty, he had inadvertently taught both of us much deeper lessons about protection, accountability, and the difference between genuine love and manipulative control. Emma was now equipped with knowledge and experiences that would help her recognize manipulation tactics and seek appropriate help when adults behaved inappropriately. She understood that standing up to bullies requires patience, evidence, and support from other trustworthy adults who prioritize safety over peace. Most importantly, she knew that broken things could sometimes be replaced with something better, but only if you had the courage to acknowledge that they were truly broken and needed to be rebuilt rather than simply glued back together. The story of Frank's downfall had become a community resource for teaching families about elder abuse prevention and the importance of direct communication between relatives rather than relying on intermediaries who might have hidden agendas. Our experience had helped create educational materials used by senior centers and family service organizations to help people recognize warning signs of financial exploitation and manipulation. Looking at Emma's happiness with her new laptop and her excitement about using it for school projects, I realized that Frank's attempt to teach her about consequences had succeeded in ways he never intended. She had learned that actions have consequences, that adults who harm children face accountability, and that standing up for what's right sometimes requires temporary conflict to achieve lasting protection. The most important lesson, though, was one that would serve Emma throughout her life. That real family loyalty means protecting vulnerable people from harm even when the person causing that harm is someone you're supposed to love unconditionally. True strength comes not from accepting abuse in the name of family unity, but from having the courage to expose abuse in the name of genuine protection and healing. Have you ever had to choose between keeping peace in your family and protecting someone from harm? How did you find the courage to do what was right, even when it meant creating conflict with people you cared about? Share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video if it helped you think about family loyalty in a new way. Subscribe for more stories about standing up to bullies and protecting the people we love. And share this with anyone who might need encouragement to speak up when they see abuse happening. Thank you for listening to Emma's and my story, and remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to let harmful behavior continue unchallenged.